1943. While Allied bombs rain down on the Eternal City and Nazi jackboots echo through ancient cobblestone streets, something extraordinary is happening beneath the very nose of the Gestapo. In monasteries, convents, and hidden chambers scattered across the occupied capital, 6,500 souls are vanishing into thin air. These aren't soldiers, these aren't spies. Their families, children, elderly grandparents, all marked for death by the Third Reich's machinery of genocide. And the man orchestrating their disappearance? A 42-year-old priest named Matteo Rinaldi, who has turned the sacred halls of the church into the most dangerous underground railroad in occupied Europe. The Nazis are hunting for these missing people with ruthless efficiency, yet somehow impossibly, they keep slipping through their fingers. How does a single priest, armed with nothing but faith and a network of terrified volunteers, pull off what might be the largest clandestine rescue operation on Italian soil? The answer will shake everything you thought you knew about courage under fire. The promise is simple but profound. By the end of this story, you'll discover how ordinary people, facing impossible odds and certain death if discovered, created a system so ingenious that it fooled one of history's most brutal occupying forces for over a year. You'll learn the truth about what happened in those hidden rooms, the narrow escapes that should have ended in mass executions, and the moral calculations that turned men and women of the cloth into master deceivers. This isn't just another war story. This is about the moment when doing nothing became more dangerous than risking everything, and how that choice rippled through thousands of lives that should have been erased from history. September 8, 1943, marks the day Italy's fragile alliance with Nazi Germany shatters completely. When the Italian government announces its armistice with the Allies, Hitler's response is swift and merciless. German troops flood into Rome, transforming the city from uncertain ally to occupied enemy territory overnight. The Wehrmacht takes control of every major intersection, every government building, every route in and out of the ancient capital. But the soldiers aren't the real danger. Following close behind are the SS units and Gestapo agents, men who carry lists, names, addresses of every Jewish family registered in Rome's census. For the Jewish community, around 12,000 people who have called this city home for over 2 millennia, the occupation means one thing. The clock has started ticking on their survival. The Vatican, that tiny sovereign state nestled within Rome's boundaries, officially declares itself neutral. Pope Pius XII issues careful diplomatic statements, walking a tightrope between condemning atrocities and avoiding direct confrontation with Berlin. But neutrality on paper and neutrality in practice are two very different things. In the shadows of Vatican bureaucracy, in the private chambers of certain cardinals and monsignors, a different conversation is taking place. The question isn't whether to help, it's how to help without bringing the full weight of Nazi fury down on the church itself. Because if the Germans discover that Vatican properties are harboring fugitives, they won't hesitate to violate diplomatic immunity. They'll raid every monastery, arrest every priest, and execute everyone involved as enemies of the Reich. This is where Padre Matteo Rinaldi enters the picture, though calling him just a priest undersells what he's about to become. At 42 years old, Rinaldi serves as a mid-level administrator at a modest monastery on Rome's outskirts, the kind of posting that usually means a quiet life of prayer, paperwork, and fading into historical obscurity. He's not a resistance fighter by training or temperament. He's never fired a weapon, never engaged in espionage, never broken a law more serious than arriving late to morning mass. His entire adult life has been defined by obedience to authority, adherence to rules, and faith in institutional order. Yet something shifts in him when the deportations begin, when he watches soldiers dragging families from their homes in the Jewish quarter, children crying, grandparents stumbling, all of them herded onto trucks bound for destinations everyone knows, but nobody wants to name. Rinaldi makes a decision that will either save thousands or get him killed, possibly both. He begins reaching out through quiet channels, carefully approaching other priests, nuns, monastery administrators, anyone who controls space that could hide a human being. The pitch is terrifyingly simple. They have empty rooms, and there are people who need to disappear. The risks are unspeakable. If the Gestapo discovers even one hidden refugee, everyone connected to that location faces immediate execution. There are no trials, no appeals. no mercy for those who hide enemies of the state. Yet somehow, impossibly, people begin saying yes. One monastery agrees to hide 5 people. A convent takes in 12. Another church creates a false wall in the basement for 20 more. Within weeks, a network is forming, held together by nothing but trust, desperation, and the shared understanding that silence means survival for everyone involved. The system Rinaldi creates isn't sophisticated, at least not at first. It's born from pure necessity and held together by improvisation. When a Jewish family receives a whispered warning that the Gestapo plans to raid their neighborhood, they have maybe 2 hours to make an impossible choice: stay and face deportation, or trust a stranger who promises salvation but might be leading them into a trap. Those who choose to run arrive at designated meeting points, usually a quiet corner near a church, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever valuables fit in their pockets. Rinaldi's volunteers, often nuns disguised in civilian clothes or priests without their collars, escort these terrified souls through back alleys and maintenance tunnels, moving only at night, taking routes that avoid main streets and German patrols. The refugees don't know where they're going until they arrive. The volunteers don't know who else is hiding where. This compartmentalization isn't just smart tradecraft, it's survival insurance. If the Nazis capture someone, they can only betray what they actually know. By October 1943, barely a month into the operation, Rinaldi's network shelters over 800 people across 47 different locations throughout Rome. Monasteries designed to house 20 monks now conceal 50 additional souls in attics, cellars, and storage rooms converted into makeshift dormitories. Convents hide families behind false walls, constructed overnight by sympathetic carpenters who work without pay and never speak of what they've built. Even private homes of ordinary Roman Catholics join the effort, middle-class families risking everything to shelter strangers in their spare bedrooms and basements. But housing people is only half the battle. These refugees need food in a city where rationing has made every meal precious. They need medicine when they fall ill, but visiting doctors means risking exposure. They need documents, because anyone stopped by German patrols without proper identification vanishes into Gestapo headquarters and never comes out. Rinaldi and his growing team of conspirators must solve these problems while leaving no paper trail, no evidence that could lead investigators back to the source. The first real crisis hits on October 16th, when SS units launch a massive pre-dawn raid on Rome's Jewish quarter. Over 1,000 people are rounded up in a single operation, dragged from their beds, and loaded onto trains headed north toward camps, whose names will soon become synonymous with humanity's darkest chapter. Rinaldi watches from a distance, powerless to intervene, as families he couldn't reach in time disappear into boxcars. The raid is a brutal reminder of what awaits everyone in his network if they make even one mistake. But it also crystallizes something in him, and everyone working this operation. They're not playing at resistance anymore. They're the last barrier between survival and annihilation for thousands of human beings who have nowhere else to turn. Failure doesn't mean imprisonment or professional ruin. Failure means watching those 6,500 hidden souls get loaded onto trains, just like the ones departing that October morning. The Germans aren't stupid, and they're certainly not blind. Colonel Klaus Zimmermann, the Gestapo officer responsible for security in occupied Rome, knows the numbers don't add up. His census records show 12,000 Jews living in the city before occupation. His raid netted just over 1,000. That leaves 11,000 people unaccounted for, and he doesn't believe for a second that they all fled to Allied lines or disappeared into the countryside. Someone is hiding them. Someone with resources and organization sophisticated enough to make thousands vanish without a trace. Zimmermann begins applying pressure, raiding known resistance meeting places, interrogating anyone with suspected ties to underground networks, and placing informants inside churches and monasteries. He issues an order. Any religious institution found harboring fugitives will see its entire staff arrested and its property seized. He means it, and Rinaldi knows he means it. Yet the network not only survives, it expands. By November, Rinaldi shelters over 1,500 people. By December, that number reaches 3,000. new hiding places open faster than the Gestapo can investigate suspicious locations. The secret isn't just Rinaldi's organizational skill, though he proves surprisingly adept at logistics, for a man whose previous career highlight was managing the monastery's library. The secret is that he's tapped into something deeper than strategy or tactics. Every person who joins this operation, every nun who hides a family in her convent, every priest who falsifies baptismal records to give Jews Christian identities, every ordinary citizen who shares their ration card with strangers, they're all making a moral calculation that transcends self-preservation. They've decided that some things matter more than survival, that witnessing genocide and doing nothing would corrupt their souls far more thoroughly than any risk the Nazis pose to their bodies. The daily reality of hiding 6,500 people in plain sight demands a level of deception that transforms everyone involved into professional liars. Rinaldi and his core team, which now includes Monsignor Vittorio Castellani, a Vatican official with access to the Church's vast bureaucratic machinery, begin mass-producing false identity documents. Church records dating back centuries become their greatest weapon. Baptismal certificates, marriage licenses, death records, all can be backdated and falsified to create entirely new identities for Jewish refugees. A family named Levi becomes the Leones, their Jewish heritage erased on paper and replaced with generations of fictional Catholic ancestry. Forgers work through the night in monastery basements, carefully aging documents with tea stains and strategic creases to make them look decades old. These aren't just pieces of paper, they're lifelines. A convincing baptismal certificate means the difference between walking past a German checkpoint or being dragged into a Gestapo interrogation room from which nobody returns. But documents alone can't protect people who don't know how to act like Catholics. Many of the refugees have never set foot in a church, have no idea how to genuflect properly or when to cross themselves during Mass. These small details, these tiny behavioral tells, could expose them instantly if a suspicious German officer decides to test their supposed faith. So Rinaldi institutes what can only be described as crash courses in Catholicism. In hidden rooms across Rome, rabbis and Jewish scholars learn to recite the Lord's Prayer, memorize the Stations of the Cross, and practice the choreography of Catholic worship. Children who've grown up celebrating Hanukkah now rehearse Christmas carols. Elderly men who've spent their lives studying Torah now carry rosaries and learn to move their lips in silent prayer when patrols pass. The psychological cost of this charade is devastating. These people aren't just hiding their bodies, they're erasing their identities, pretending their entire heritage doesn't exist, all while grief and terror eat away at them from the inside. The hiding places themselves become increasingly creative as the operation scales up. Early efforts relied on obvious solutions like attics and cellars, but those are exactly where Gestapo search teams look first during raids. So Rinaldi's network evolves. In one monastery, carpenters construct a false floor in the chapel, creating a crawl space barely 3 feet high where 20 people can squeeze together in absolute silence during surprise inspections. A convent installs a rotating bookshelf that conceals a room housing 15 refugees, the mechanism so well balanced that even elderly nuns can operate it with a gentle push. Another location hides people inside a massive organ in the church sanctuary, the instrument still functional, even with human beings crammed into the spaces between its pipes. Perhaps most audacious is the monastery that disguises refugees as monks, giving them robes and placing them in plain sight during German visits, counting on the Nazis' reluctance to thoroughly search men supposedly devoted to God. Food becomes an escalating crisis as winter arrives, and the network swells past 4,000 hidden souls. Rome's rationing system allocates food based on registered residents, and suddenly these religious institutions are feeding 3, 4, sometimes 5 times their official population. Buying extra supplies on the black market is dangerous because it draws attention, but letting people starve isn't an option. Rinaldi develops relationships with sympathetic farmers outside the city who smuggle produce into Rome, hidden beneath legitimate deliveries to churches. Monsignor Castellani diverts Vatican food stores meant for official functions, risking his position by quietly redistributing resources to the hiding network. Ordinary Romans many of them barely getting by themselves, share what little they have. A loaf of bread gets divided among 8 people instead of 4. Watered-down soup stretches further. Everyone goes hungry, but nobody starves, at least not yet. The psychological strain on everyone involved reaches breaking points that should shatter the entire operation. Refugees live in constant terror, knowing that one child's cry at the wrong moment, one cough during a German inspection, could doom everyone in the building. They spend months, sometimes over a year, confined to cramped spaces with minimal sunlight and no privacy. Families fracture under the pressure. Mental health collapses. Yet Rinaldi keeps them together through something that transcends mere survival. He visits the hiding places personally, moving through Rome's dangerous streets to bring not just supplies, but hope. He tells them about Allied advances, about German setbacks, about the world beyond their walls that still exists and will welcome them back someday. He prays with them, not the performative Catholicism they've learned to fake, but in acknowledgement of whatever faith sustains them through this nightmare. He becomes more than a coordinator of logistics. He becomes the human connection that reminds them why survival matters. January 1944 brings the operation's first catastrophic close call, the kind of near disaster that should collapse the entire network and send everyone involved to execution chambers. A Gestapo informant, a Roman collaborator hoping to earn favor with the occupiers, reports suspicious activity at the Convent of the Sacred Heart, one of Rinaldi's largest hiding locations, currently sheltering 93 people. Colonel Zimmermann personally leads the raid, arriving with 24 SS troops at 4 in the morning, the hour when people sleep deepest and react slowest. The nuns have maybe 90 seconds of warning, just enough time for the night watchman to spot the approaching trucks and ring the emergency bell. What follows is a choreographed miracle born from months of preparation and dozens of drills. Refugees pour out of dormitories and into pre-assigned hiding spots. The false wall in the basement swallows 40 people. The organ conceals 12 more. Others squeeze into spaces behind wardrobes, under floorboards, inside massive laundry hampers filled with habits and linens. 3 families climb into the convent's well, clinging to the sides above the waterline in absolute darkness, praying the Germans don't decide to check if the water's clean. Zimmermann's search is methodical and brutal. His men tear through every room, overturning beds, smashing furniture, probing walls for hollow spaces. They bring dogs trained to detect human scent, animals that bark furiously at the false wall but can't pinpoint exactly where the hidden chamber begins. The colonel interrogates the Mother Superior for 3 hours, alternating between threats of execution and promises of leniency if she cooperates. She tells him the truth in the most convincing way possible. She claims ignorance. She's just an old woman running a convent, she insists. She has no idea what he's talking about. Perhaps the dogs smell the kitchen staff or the nuns in the adjacent building. Her performance is flawless because it's grounded in a deeper truth. She genuinely believes that protecting these 93 souls matters more than her own life, and that conviction radiates an authenticity no acting could achieve. Zimmermann leaves empty-handed after 6 hours, but he doesn't leave convinced. He stations observers across the street, men who watch the convent day and night, waiting for the mistake that will confirm his suspicions. The refugees remain in their hiding spots for 38 hours straight, unable to move, unable to make sound, barely able to breathe in spaces designed for short-term concealment during brief searches. Children who need to cry have their mouths gently covered by mothers who whisper desperate reassurances. Elderly people with bladder problems suffer in humiliating silence. 3 families in the well stand in freezing water up to their waists, their legs going numb, hypothermia setting in. But they don't climb out because the German observers might hear the splash. When Rinaldi finally gets word that it's safe to emerge, he finds people who've been pushed past human limits. 2 elderly refugees require immediate medical attention for exposure. A young mother has suffered a complete psychological break and won't speak for weeks. A child has stopped responding to his own name, yet nobody was captured, nobody broke. The network survived, but the cost of that survival is written on 93 faces that will never look quite the same again. This near catastrophe forces Rinaldi to evolve his strategy once more. The Germans are clearly getting better at identifying hiding locations, which means staying in one place too long has become a death sentence. He begins rotating refugees between safe houses, moving people every few weeks to different locations across the city. This multiplies the risk, because every move means exposure, means vulnerable people traveling through streets patrolled by enemies actively hunting them. But staying put means giving Zimmerman time to investigate, to surveil, to prepare raids that his prey can't escape. So Rinaldi's volunteers become expert at nighttime logistics, moving families through Rome's ancient catacombs, through maintenance tunnels that connect buildings, even through the city's sewer system when absolutely necessary. They time movements to coincide with Allied bombing raids, using the chaos and confusion of air attacks as cover for transferring people between hiding spots. The operation's scope reaches its peak in March 1944, when Rinaldi's network shelters its maximum number. 6,517 people spread across 155 locations throughout occupied Rome. To put that in perspective, he's essentially hiding a small town's worth of human beings in a city crawling with Gestapo agents specifically tasked with finding them. The logistics alone should be impossible. Feeding that many people requires diverting tons of food every week. Housing them demands constant maintenance and expansion of hiding spaces. Protecting them means maintaining perfect operational security across hundreds of volunteers, any one of whom could destroy everything with a single careless word. Yet somehow, against all probability, the system holds. The secret isn't superior planning or brilliant strategy. The secret is that everyone involved has internalized a truth that transcends fear. They're all already dead if they fail, so they might as well risk everything for the chance that some good comes from their sacrifice. April 1944 brings a development that changes everything, though nobody realizes it at first. Allied forces break through German lines at Monte Cassino, a breakthrough that means liberation is no longer a distant dream, but an approaching reality. The news spreads through Rinaldi's network like electricity through wire, bringing hope to people who've survived months of confinement on nothing but faith and stubbornness. But hope is a double-edged sword in occupied territory. As German control over Rome begins to crack, as Nazi officials start planning their eventual retreat, some within the SS hierarchy decide that if they're losing Italy anyway, they might as well complete their mission of extermination before Allied troops arrive. Zimmerman receives new orders from Berlin: find the hidden Jews and liquidate them before evacuation. The hunt intensifies to levels that make previous efforts look casual. Gestapo teams begin raiding churches at random, no longer waiting for intelligence or informant tips, just kicking down doors and searching anything that looks suspicious. Rinaldi knows the endgame is approaching, knows that Allied liberation could arrive in weeks or months, but he also knows that timing is everything. If the network can hold together just a little longer, if they can keep 6,500 people hidden through this final, most dangerous phase, then everyone survives. If they crack now, when victory is so close, then all the sacrifice, all the suffering, all the impossible odds they've overcome mean nothing. He pushes his volunteers harder than ever, demanding perfection in an operation that's running on fumes and prayers. Safe houses that showed any sign of compromise get evacuated immediately. People moved in the middle of the day, despite the risks, because waiting for nightfall might mean walking into Gestapo raids. The false identity documents get updated constantly, because the Germans keep changing their verification procedures, keep adding new security features that Rinaldi's forgers must replicate perfectly or watch their people get arrested at checkpoints. The breaking point almost arrives in early May, when 3 separate hiding locations get raided within 48 hours. The coincidence is too precise to be random, which means someone's talking, either voluntarily or under torture. Rinaldi faces an impossible choice: shut down the entire network and scatter everyone into individual hiding, which might save some but will definitely doom others, or keep operating and hope they can identify and eliminate the security breach before it destroys everything. He chooses to keep going but implements brutal new protocols. Volunteers who know too much get rotated out and hidden themselves, their knowledge compartmentalized and buried. Communication between safe houses gets reduced to absolute minimum, with messages delivered only through trusted couriers who memorize everything and carry nothing in writing. Refugees receive instructions to prepare for immediate evacuation at any moment, to sleep in their clothes with their few possessions already packed. The psychological toll on Rinaldi himself becomes visible to everyone around him. This man, who started as a mild-mannered monastery administrator, has transformed into someone harder, someone who makes calculations about acceptable losses and strategic sacrifices that would have horrified him 18 months ago. He's lost weight he didn't have to lose, survives on maybe 3 hours of sleep per night, and has developed a tremor in his hands from constant stress and exhaustion. Monsignor Castellani privately worries that Rinaldi is burning himself out, that the weight of responsibility for 6,500 lives is crushing him from the inside. But there's nobody else who can do what he does, nobody else who holds all the threads of this impossibly complex operation in their head, who knows which volunteers are reliable and which are cracking, who understands the rhythm of German patrol patterns and the timing of Allied bombing runs. May 20th, 1944 becomes the night that tests whether everything they've built can withstand maximum pressure. Intelligence reaches Rinaldi through Castellani's Vatican contacts. Zimmermann has ordered simultaneous raids on 20 locations across Rome, scheduled for dawn the next morning. It's the most aggressive action yet, a final desperate attempt to catch the network before Allied forces arrive and end German control forever. Rinaldi has maybe 8 hours to warn 20 different safe houses, to evacuate over 400 people who need to vanish into backup hiding spots that may or may not be secure. His volunteers scatter across the city in the darkness, racing against time and probability. Some families get moved successfully. Others receive warning just minutes before Gestapo trucks arrive, barely escaping through back exits while German boots kick in front doors. By sunrise, Rinaldi has lost count of how many people are, where has no idea if everyone made it out, or if some got caught in the chaos. The aftermath of Zimmermann's coordinated raids reveals both the network's greatest triumph and its most devastating failure. 19 of the 20 targeted locations were evacuated successfully. 412 people vanished into backup hiding spots moments before German troops smashed through doors. But the 20th location, a small monastery on Rome's eastern outskirts, didn't receive warning in time. The courier assigned to alert them got stopped at a checkpoint, detained for document verification that should have taken 5 minutes, but stretched to 30 because the German officer was thorough and suspicious. By the time the courier reached the monastery, Gestapo trucks were already pulling up outside. 17 people were captured that morning, including an entire family with 3 children under age 10. Rinaldi hears the news and something breaks inside him that won't heal. Not ever. He'd promised these people safety, had looked them in the eyes and sworn that his network would protect them, and now they're on a train heading north toward camps whose names are whispered in terror throughout occupied Europe. The guilt threatens to paralyze him completely, but there's no time for paralysis, because 6,383 people still depend on decisions he makes in the next hours and days. Allied forces are advancing up the Italian peninsula faster than anyone expected, which means liberation could arrive in weeks, but it also means the Germans are growing increasingly desperate and unpredictable. Some Nazi units are surrendering, others are fighting with fanatical intensity, and nobody knows which mindset will dominate when Rome's occupation finally ends. Rinaldi restructures the entire operation around a single assumption: they need to survive just a little longer, need to keep everyone hidden through this final chaotic period when the old order is collapsing, but the new one hasn't arrived yet. He stops thinking about the operation in terms of months or weeks. Every single day that passes, with 6,300 people still breathing, is a victory. Every sunrise that finds them undiscovered is a miracle. The city itself begins transforming around them as May bleeds into June. German troops establish defensive positions throughout Rome, clearly preparing for urban combat when Allied forces arrive. Artillery pieces appear on street corners, machine gun nests get dug into ancient ruins, entire neighborhoods get designated as kill zones where civilians are forbidden. For Rinaldi's network, this militarization creates new dangers and unexpected opportunities. The Germans are so focused on preparing for battle that their searches for hidden Jews become less frequent, less thorough. Zimmerman himself gets reassigned to defensive planning, his obsessive hunt for the missing thousands subordinated to more immediate military concerns. The network exploits this breathing room, moving people out of locations too close to planned battle zones and consolidating them in areas the Germans have written off as strategically irrelevant. But consolidation brings its own risks, because putting more people in fewer locations means that a single compromise could be catastrophic. One basement that previously hid 40 people now conceals 90. A convent designed for 20 nuns now houses over 100 refugees crammed into every available space. The conditions deteriorate rapidly. Sanitation becomes nearly impossible with so many people sharing facilities designed for a fraction of that number. Disease spreads through the overcrowded hiding spots, respiratory infections and dysentery burning through populations weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and constant stress. Rinaldi can't bring doctors to these locations without risking exposure, so nuns with basic medical training do what they can with limited supplies and desperate improvisation. People die in hiding, their bodies spirited away for burial in unmarked graves because a death record with the wrong location could expose the entire operation. The psychological atmosphere among the refugees shifts as liberation approaches. After so many months of darkness, of confinement, of terror that every sound might be Gestapo boots in the hallway, some people begin to crack under the weight of hope itself. They've survived this long by accepting that death was probable, that each day might be their last. But now, with freedom actually visible on the horizon, the possibility that they might not make it, that they could die in hiding just days or hours before Allied troops arrive, becomes unbearable. Rinaldi spends more and more time talking people back from edges they're teetering on, convincing them to hold together just a little longer, to not surrender to despair when victory is so close they can almost touch it. He's exhausted in ways that sleep can't fix, running on pure willpower, and the knowledge that if he falls apart, 6,300 people lose the one person who's been their anchor through 18 months of hell. June 4th, 1944 arrives like thunder breaking through endless storm clouds. Allied forces enter Rome, not with the massive battle everyone feared, but with a strange, almost anticlimactic efficiency. German commanders, recognizing that defending the city means destroying it, order a withdrawal rather than fight street by street through 2,000 years of irreplaceable history. By mid-morning, American tanks are rolling through neighborhoods that were under Nazi control just hours earlier. The sounds that have defined occupied Rome for 9 months, the harsh German commands, the military vehicles grinding through ancient streets, the terrifying midnight raids, all of it simply stops. In hiding places across the city, refugees hear new voices outside, voices speaking English with American accents, voices that mean the nightmare has finally ended. But Rinaldi, even in this moment of triumph, can't allow celebration yet. German units are still retreating through parts of the city, scattered SS holdouts who might decide to inflict final acts of violence before evacuation. He sends word through the network: stay hidden until we confirm complete liberation. Don't emerge until we're absolutely certain. The confirmation comes in waves throughout the day, as Rinaldi's volunteers venture into streets now controlled by Allied forces and verify that the Germans are truly gone. Only then does he begin the process of bringing 6,300 people back into the light. The scenes that unfold across Rome over the next 48 hours defy adequate description. Families who've spent over a year in cramped basements step outside and collapse from overwhelming emotion the moment sunlight touches their faces. Children who've learned to stay silent at all times suddenly scream and laugh and run through streets they'd forgotten existed. Elderly refugees who'd convinced themselves they'd die in hiding weep with gratitude so intense it borders on religious ecstasy. Nuns and priests who risked execution to shelter these souls embrace the people they've protected, everyone crying together in relief that transcends language or faith. American soldiers, hardened by combat and expecting to find starving, desperate refugees, instead witness organized groups emerging from impossible hiding spots, malnourished and traumatized but alive, so impossibly alive. The true scope of what Rinaldi accomplished becomes clear only when Allied intelligence officers begin documenting the network. They interview refugees, volunteers, compile records of hiding locations, and gradually piece together a picture that staggers them. 6,383 people saved, 155 hiding locations across occupied Rome, hundreds of volunteers who risked everything. 18 months of operation under the nose of the Gestapo, of SS raids, of constant surveillance and betrayal threats. The numbers alone are impressive, but what truly shocks the investigators is the operational security. In 18 months of hiding thousands, the network lost only 17 people to German raids, a success rate that shouldn't be statistically possible given the circumstances. Professional intelligence officers, who've run spy networks with far less at stake, can't comprehend how a parish priest with no training managed this level of operational excellence while keeping 6,300 secrets simultaneously. But the cost becomes equally clear as the full accounting emerges. 7 volunteers were captured and executed during the operation, brave souls who died under torture without revealing what they knew. 43 refugees died in hiding from illness, injury, or the accumulated stress of confinement. Families were fractured by the psychological toll, marriages destroyed, children traumatized in ways that will echo through decades. The 17 captured in that final raid haunt Rinaldi with particular intensity. He learns their fate through Red Cross channels weeks later. They were loaded onto one of the last trains leaving Italy for Auschwitz, arrived at the camp just as the Nazi extermination machine reached its peak efficiency, and were murdered within hours of arrival. 3 children, 7 adults gone because a courier got delayed at a checkpoint because timing failed by 30 minutes in an operation that ran for over 500 days. Rinaldi himself emerges from the operation, transformed beyond recognition. The mild-mannered administrator who began this journey has become someone harder, someone who carries 6,300 lives worth of responsibility and 17 deaths worth of guilt. He doesn't celebrate liberation like others around him, doesn't feel the joy that should come with victory. Instead, he moves through Rome's streets in a daze, visiting the hiding places now emptied of their secret occupants, running his hands over false walls and concealed doors, trying to process that it's actually over. Monsignor Castellani finds him in a monastery basement 3 days after liberation, sitting alone in a space that once held 40 people, crying for the first time since the operation began. The tears aren't relief or happiness or even grief for those lost. They're the accumulated weight of 18 months of impossible decisions, of choosing who to move and who to leave in place, of calculating acceptable risks with human lives, of playing God with people's survival and somehow impossibly mostly getting it right. The weeks following liberation reveal truths that Rinaldi's exhausted mind couldn't fully process during the operation itself. As Allied investigators interview the saved refugees and document their testimonies, patterns emerge that redefine what everyone thought they understood about the network's success. It wasn't just Rinaldi's organizational genius or the volunteers' courage, though both were essential. The operation survived because it tapped into something deeper, a web of ordinary Romans who never formally joined the network, but made small choices that accumulated into massive impact. The baker who never asked why a monastery suddenly needed 3 times its usual bread order, the city water worker who noticed unusually high consumption at certain buildings and deliberately didn't report it, the postal employee who intercepted Gestapo surveillance reports before they reached headquarters and lost them in bureaucratic confusion. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people who saw something suspicious, understood what it meant, and chose silence over collaboration. They were never on Rinaldi's lists, never knew the full scope of what they were protecting, but without their quiet complicity, the network would have collapsed in weeks. Colonel Klaus Zimmermann's fate adds a bitter footnote to the story. After German withdrawal from Rome, he retreated north with remaining Nazi forces and continued his work hunting Jews in territories still under German control. Allied forces captured him in April 1945 as the war in Europe reached its final collapse. During interrogation, he remained convinced that Rome's missing thousands had fled to Allied lines or hidden in the countryside, that no organized network could possibly have concealed that many people right under his nose. When investigators showed him the documentation, the lists of hiding locations he'd walked past dozens of times, the proof that people he'd been hunting were sometimes hiding in buildings he'd personally searched, something broke in him. His entire professional identity had been built on the assumption of German superiority, of Gestapo efficiency, of the inevitability that Jews would be found and eliminated. Learning that a priest and a collection of nuns had outwitted him for 18 months, that thousands escaped his grasp through methods that seem obvious in hindsight, shattered whatever remained of his worldview. The refugees themselves face the complicated reality of survival in the aftermath. They're alive, which should be everything, but many have lost entire families to the Holocaust. They emerge from hiding to discover that parents, siblings, cousins who didn't make it to Rome or didn't find Rinaldi's network have been murdered in camps across Europe. The guilt of survival becomes crushing for some, the question of why they deserved to live when millions didn't. Rinaldi tries to help them process this, but he's drowning in his own survivor's guilt, his own impossible questions about the 17 who died because he couldn't save everyone. The psychological damage to the hidden children becomes particularly evident. Kids who spent critical developmental years in silence, in darkness, in constant fear, now struggle with basic social interaction. They flinch at loud noises, can't sleep without checking hiding spots, have panic attacks when they see anyone in uniform, even if it's Allied soldiers who liberated them. Yet amid the trauma and grief, something profound emerges. The 6,300 survivors begin rebuilding their lives with a fierce determination born from having already survived the unsurvivable. They've stared into the abyss of industrial genocide and clawed their way back through nothing but luck and the courage of strangers. That experience, as horrifying as it was, gives them a foundation that can't be shaken. Some stay in Rome, reclaiming properties seized by the Nazis and rebuilding the Jewish community that predates Christianity itself in this ancient city. Others emigrate to America, to Palestine, to anywhere that will take them, carrying stories of their survival and the names of people like Rinaldi, who prove that goodness exists even in humanity's darkest moments. They marry, have children, build careers, and live lives that the Third Reich tried to erase. Every birthday, every graduation, every moment of joy is an act of defiance against the extermination machine that failed to destroy them. Rinaldi himself refuses recognition for what he's done, declines medals, and honors that Allied authorities try to bestow. He doesn't want to be called a hero, doesn't want his name attached to the operation as if he did this alone. He insists that the credit belongs to the hundreds of volunteers who risked everything, to the ordinary Romans who chose silence, to the refugees themselves who survived conditions that should have broken them. When journalists try to interview him, he redirects them to the nuns who hid families, to the forgers who created false documents, to anyone except himself. The attention makes him deeply uncomfortable because it forces him to relive decisions he'd rather forget, to remember the 17 faces of people he couldn't save. He returns to his monastery, tries to resume the quiet life of prayer and administration he had before the war, but that person doesn't exist anymore. You can't hold 6,300 lives in your hands and go back to managing library inventory like nothing happened. The year following liberation brings a reckoning that extends far beyond Rome's borders. As the full scope of the Holocaust becomes undeniable, as Allied forces liberate concentration camps and document industrial murder on a scale that defies comprehension, Rinaldi's operation takes on new significance. He didn't just save 6,300 people from occupation or deportation, he saved them from systematic extermination. Those 17 who were captured and sent north, they were among 6 million. The families hiding in his network. They represent a fragment of survival in an ocean of annihilation. International Jewish organizations begin reaching out, asking Rinaldi to testify about what happened in Rome, to help build the historical record of resistance and rescue amid genocide. He agrees reluctantly, travels to tribunals and documentation centers, tells the story in flat, emotionless tones that barely hint at the psychological cost. Interviewers note that he never uses the word hero to describe anyone involved, never frames the operation as triumph, only as necessary response to unacceptable evil. The Vatican's role in the operation becomes a source of intense debate and controversy that will echo for decades. Pope Pius XII maintained official neutrality throughout the war, never explicitly condemning the Holocaust in public statements, a silence that many Jewish leaders and historians will criticize as moral failure. Yet that same Vatican provided the bureaucratic infrastructure that made Rinaldi's network possible. Monsignor Castellani and other officials quietly diverted resources, falsified documents, and used diplomatic immunity to shield rescue operations from German retaliation. The contradiction is difficult to reconcile. An institution that wouldn't speak openly against genocide nonetheless enabled one of the most successful rescue operations in occupied Europe. Rinaldi refuses to judge the Vatican's broader choices, says only that Castellani and others gave him tools he desperately needed and accepted enormous personal risk to do so. The moral complexity of operating within a system that prioritized institutional survival over explicit moral stands haunts everyone involved. Zimmermann's trial in 1947 forces Rinaldi to confront his enemy face to face for the first time since liberation. The prosecutor asks Rinaldi to testify about the network, to explain how he deceived Gestapo operations for 18 months. Rinaldi sits in the witness stand and describes the operation in clinical detail, the hiding places, the false documents, the rotation schedules. Zimmermann listens from the defendant's chair, his face registering something between disbelief and grudging respect. When Rinaldi finishes, the prosecutor asks if he has anything to say directly to the man who hunted his network so relentlessly. Rinaldi turns, looks at Zimmermann, and says simply that he's grateful the colonel failed, grateful that German efficiency proved less effective than faith and desperation. Zimmermann is convicted and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, though he'll serve only 12 before being released in the general amnesty of former Nazi officials that characterizes the late 1950s. The volunteers who survived the operation scatter to different fates. Some nuns continue their religious vocations, though they carry scars that prayer can't entirely heal. Others leave religious life entirely, unable to reconcile faith with what they witnessed during the occupation. The forgers who created false documents find their skills in demand for various post-war causes, some legitimate and some less so. The ordinary Romans who sheltered refugees returned to ordinary lives, never speaking publicly about what they did, treating their heroism as simply what decent people do when faced with indecent circumstances. A few volunteers suffer complete psychological breaks, the accumulated trauma of 18 months finally overwhelming them once the adrenaline and necessity fade. Rinaldi tries to stay in contact with as many as possible, feels responsible for their well-being, the same way he felt responsible for the refugees, but people drift apart and connections fray as post-war Italy rebuilds itself. By 1950, just 6 years after liberation, the operation is already fading into history. The refugees have dispersed globally, the volunteers have moved on, the hiding places have been repaired and returned to normal use with no plaques or markers indicating what happened there. Rinaldi, now 51 years old but looking decades older, divides his time between monastery duties and quiet work, documenting the operation for historical archives. He's obsessive about getting details right, about naming every volunteer, about preserving the memory of those 17 who were captured. He knows that history has a tendency to simplify, to reduce complex operations to single heroic figures, and he's determined to resist that narrative. This wasn't one man saving thousands, it was hundreds of people making impossible choices together. He writes their names in careful script, attaches photographs when available, notes their contributions with the precision of someone who understands that memory is fragile and must be defended against distortion. Padre Matteo Rinaldi died in 1973 at the age of 74. His passing noted briefly in local Roman newspapers, but largely unnoticed by the wider world. He spent his final 3 decades living quietly in the same monastery where the operation began, never seeking recognition, never writing memoirs, never capitalizing on what he'd accomplished. The refugees he saved scattered across continents, but many maintained contact with him until the end. sending letters and photographs of children and grandchildren who existed only because a priest decided that some things mattered more than safety. At his funeral, over 200 people gathered, many of them elderly survivors who'd traveled from Israel, America, Argentina, and beyond to say goodbye to the man who gave them futures. They told their stories to younger generations present, described hiding in organ pipes and false-walled basements, explained how this quiet man orchestrated their survival through impossible odds. The younger listeners struggled to reconcile the frail elderly priest being eulogized with the figure described in these testimonies, the man who ran a clandestine operation that should have been beyond his capabilities. The moral weight of what Rinaldi did, what it cost him and everyone involved, deserves deeper reflection than simple hero worship allows. He made choices that violated every rule of his religious order, falsified sacred documents, lied to authorities, harbored fugitives, and trained others to do the same. By the legal and ecclesiastical standards of his time, he was a criminal who corrupted the Church's neutrality and endangered its institutional position. Yet by any human moral standard, he was simply responding to genocide the only way conscience allowed. This tension between institutional rules and human necessity defines the operation's true significance. Rinaldi proved that sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking every rule, that morality and legality can diverge so completely that choosing one means abandoning the other. He never resolved this tension for himself, carried guilt about his deceptions until his death, but he also never regretted the choice. Given the same circumstances, knowing the cost, he would do it again. The question that haunts this story isn't whether Rinaldi was heroic, it's whether his heroism should have been necessary at all. 6,300 people survived because one priest and hundreds of volunteers risked everything to hide them. But 6 million people died because most of the world looked away, because nations closed their borders, because institutions prioritized stability over intervention. The operation's success highlights an unbearable truth. All those lives could have been saved if more people had been willing to pay the price Rinaldi and his network accepted. Every refugee hidden in a Roman monastery represents thousands who weren't hidden elsewhere, who knocked on doors that stayed closed, who begged for sanctuary that never came. The survivors themselves understood this better than anyone. Many spoke in later years about the randomness of their salvation, how they reached Rinaldi's network through luck or chance, while family members just as deserving perished because they were in the wrong city or trusted the wrong contact. So here's the question this story demands you answer. What would you have done? Not in the abstract, not in the comfortable distance of historical analysis, but in the concrete reality Rinaldi faced. Would you hide strangers in your home knowing that discovery means execution? Would you falsify documents, lie to authorities, risk everything you've built for people you've never met? Would you make the choice that transforms you from law-abiding citizen into criminal fugitive knowing you can never go back? It's easy to admire Rinaldi's courage from 80 years away, but courage only means something when it costs something. The volunteers who sheltered refugees gave up safety, certainty, and often their lives. The refugees who trusted the network gave up their identities, their heritage, their dignity. And Rinaldi gave up the peaceful obscurity he clearly craved, accepting instead the crushing weight of 6,300 lives and the haunting memory of 17 he couldn't save. This story matters today because the choice Rinaldi faced, the fundamental question of whether to protect vulnerable people at personal cost, never stopped being relevant. The names change, the locations shift, the specific circumstances evolve, but the core moral test remains constant. There are always people who need sanctuary, always authorities demanding compliance, always institutional pressures favoring neutrality over intervention. Rinaldi's operation wasn't exceptional because he possessed unique qualities unavailable to others. It was exceptional because he refused to accept that genocide was someone else's problem, refused to hide behind institutional neutrality when human beings needed help. The volunteers weren't superhuman. They were bakers and nuns and clerks who decided that witnessing atrocity and doing nothing would corrupt them more thoroughly than any risk the Nazis posed. That decision, that fundamental choice to act when inaction was easier and safer, That's the legacy that transcends historical specifics and speaks directly to how we live now. 6,300 people survived because enough individuals decided their lives mattered more than rules, more than safety, more than institutional preservation. And the question this story leaves burning in its wake is simple and terrible. How many more could have survived if more people had made that same choice?